Yay Networks.
Dr. Courtney Peterson is an internationally recognized researcher in this field of intermittent fasting. Her research focuses on daily intermittent fasting, also known as time-restricted eating. She was actually the first to test early time-restricted eating in humans. She's the principal investigator of several ongoing clinical trials on time-restricted eating and serves as co-investigator on a handful of other studies on intermittent fasting. She has an upcoming study that's also currently recruiting participants. It might be something you're interested in if you've been thinking maybe about dabbling in intermittent fasting and you'd like a little bit of guidance on how to. It is a study looking at the effect of intermittent fasting on aging factors. There will be sites for this both in Louisiana and Alabama, and we'll share more about that coming up as well. Dr. Courtney Peterson she's just a wealth of information and education, y'all. She graduated from Georgetown University with dual degrees in physics and biology. She holds a PhD in physics from Harvard University and 4 master's degrees. Her Master of Science in Science Communication from Imperial College London, her Master of Advanced Study and Master's in Theoretical Physics and Applied Mathematics from the University of Cambridge, and she trained in metabolism and nutrition at Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge and also chronobiology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Her research has been featured in more than 50 media outlets, including NBC Nightly News, The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Good Morning America, the BBC, Scientific American, and it's reaching a circulation of more than 104 million people around the world. A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. So welcome, Dr. Peterson. I have been really looking forward to this interview. Thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
There's so much to talk about with intermittent fasting. And before we even get started in the science, your research, talk to me about why is intermittent fasting so polarizing? I find it such a divisive topic, especially among health professionals. I see it with registered dietitians. What's your take on why it's so polarizing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, most people I talk to, there's not a lot of polarization. However, I do know that what's quite interesting is there's been a huge explosion in intermittent fasting research since it really hit the scene. So most people don't know this, but shortly after the turn of the century, we saw some of the first human clinical trials on intermittent fasting. And research really kind of petered along for a decade. Very little research was being done. And it was sort of relegated to the realm of, alternative health. This is a fad. And fast forward to the present, and I would say in the last even 3 years, we've had an explosion of clinical trials. So I'll give an example. There's a type of intermittent fasting known as the 5-2 diet. When I started in the field, there were maybe 2 or 3 studies on it, and now there are 25. And if you don't follow the literature, you kind of don't know, what the bulk of the research has shown. And so what I find is really quite interesting. You tend to have people who think intermittent fasting is the solution for everything. And I'm happy to walk through what we actually have evidence for. And then other folks who maybe read one, what we call null study, or one study finding that has no benefits, and then they assume that's true of the field as a whole. And so I think people bring a lot of their preconceptions. And then I would say specifically among dietitians, I think there's a lot of worry that intermittent fasting will exacerbate eating disorders or cause eating disorders. Now, no one's run a clinical trial in participants who have eating disorders. So we don't know for certain if you have a history of eating disorder, will that trigger like a relapse. However, in the general public, we find no increase in symptoms of eating disorders.
I think that the way I look at it is when we see different approaches that people try, nutritional approaches, it's so individual. People's responses to things are so individual. what drives someone or motivates them or really works within their lifestyle or they're experiencing that benefit from, you can't always anticipate it. And so when I look at it, is this harmful? Is there a reason not to do it? And if not, then let's find a way that we can support them. And maybe if there's something that's so extreme, we kind of maybe help to maybe bring them back to that middle. But I largely think that when I look at intermittent fasting, there's so much data that shows a positive benefit. It's been stunning to me, the backlash that I see. In fact, just this afternoon, I was emailing with a writer who writes for a lot of women's publications, magazines and such. And she had covered this topic and she had gotten some really strong feedback, and she had posted about it on her personal account. She actually removed that post, and it was such negative feedback from from dietitians. And I was like, that it was really interesting timing, because I was like, wait, you're going to have to listen to this podcast after I do this with Dr. Peterson. But it was, she actually removed the post, but because she said, and she was turning to me for guidance as a dietitian, tell me, am I out of line on this? And, so I think for our listeners, just knowing that, anytime there's something new, I agree so much with you, Dr. Peterson, that if someone is maybe a little bit of old tape, I think that a decade ago, if you would have asked me about intermittent fasting, and like you said, for the past 20 plus years, there's been a little bit more and more and more, and then a rapid growth, a surge of research. But if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I was dismissive of it. And I thought, this is so trendy. People are asking me about it. I wish that they would just let it go. And then, what really caught my eye first about it and really caught my attention was the brain benefits. And I was looking at, I was writing an article at the time on nutritional approaches, nutritional strategies to reduce risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. And one was intermittent fasting with a 12-hour fasting window, leaving at least 3 hours between dinner and your overnight fast, and reducing the types of plaques that are associated with the brain plaques, the beta amyloid plaques that are linked to Alzheimer's. And that was, it stopped me in my tracks. I was like, wait a second. And then I started looking a little bit more at it. And I'm like, hold on, there's been a lot coming out in these past years that it's opening ourselves to that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So you bring up an interesting point about the brain benefits. So it's interesting. So what we know is that, when you fast, so if you think about what happens after you stop eating, roughly the first, we're going to say roughly 12 hours, you're mostly burning through the food that you just ate, as well as any sort of stored glycogen that you have in your liver. And it's really only once you get to about 14 hours of fasting, roughly, that you see a big increase in what we call fat oxidation. So or burning of stored fat. And it looks like around that period, you have a bunch of really profound changes in the body. So your body is switching from primarily burning carbohydrate for fuel to fat for fuel. So once you really switch from burning primarily carbohydrate for fuel to fat for fuel, we see a wide array of changes in the body. And those include things like increases in autophagy. And autophagy is basically a rejuvenation program in your body where your body goes around and recycles sort of old, worn out proteins within your cells. We also see a decrease in blood pressure, blood sugar levels, insulin levels. We see decreases in oxidative stress. We see increases in sort of what we call stress resistance, which you can think of as the resilience of cells. We just see these wide sweeping programs, including sort of anti-aging programs, activated. So today we've kind of gone from a very immature science to we know a lot of the molecular mechanisms that mediate these benefits. So as one really fascinating teaser, there have been 3 studies now in animals that show that intermittent fasting extends lifespan. And 2 of those studies have concluded that the way in which intermittent fasting extends lifespan is by increasing autophagy. And in these studies, in particular, have been done in rodents, if you knock out the genes involved in autophagy, so in other words, if you block autophagy from happening, intermittent fasting can't increase lifespan. So we're even now piecing together some of these really fascinating mechanisms for how intermittent fasting works. And there are a lot of different mechanisms, which I'm happy to talk about on the podcast. But it just gives you a teaser for some of like the really fascinating research. This isn't a fad. We can demonstrate it in animals and it increases lifespan, which is perhaps like the top sort of thing you can kind of hope for.
It's also almost one of those things that seems out of reach for people. I think they're not even aiming that high. A lot of times, people may start intermittent fasting to lose 5 pounds, 10 pounds, but it goes so far beyond weight, which we'll talk about. Tell me, how did you get involved in intermittent fasting research? How did you kind of take this path?
Yeah, interesting question. So I actually went to graduate school for physics, and I studied the cosmology of the early universe. So we can kind of think of it as like a sort of similar to astrophysics, but physics questions about how the universe came to be. And in 2008, I remember listening to this podcast where they talked about this intermittent fasting study. And this literally was one of the first intermittent fasting studies ever done in humans, where they had people eat in a 4-hour period and fast for 20 hours a day. And I thought, this sounded so fascinating. And they talked about all these great benefits from intermittent fasting. Now, it turned out like the podcast actually got the details wrong in this particular study. There are no benefits from intermittent fasting. But I sort of got intrigued about it. And around the same time, really in the first decade of this century, there's a big increase in what we knew about the circadian system. And so there was kind of a growing movement to looking at how the time of day that you do certain things affects your health. So the time of day that you sleep and eat and so forth. And I was also sort of noticing that I was able to eat and digest more food earlier in the day. So I got very interested in this whole meta area of intermittent fasting and meal timing. And then I was thinking about fasting per se as like one of the most powerful things you can do from a therapeutic perspective, because there are a lot of case reports on it. And I was thinking, if you wanted to have a lifelong practice of fasting, what would you do to get maximal benefit? And I thought, probably the best thing to do would be something you can do daily. So that kind of led me to daily intermittent fasting. Because if you think about, well, what if I fast, I don't know, every month for like 3 days? That's a hard ask, I think, for someone to do as a lifelong practice. But if you slightly extended your fasting period every day, I think that's more doable. And so even before the term time restricted eating had been coined or developed, which we'll cover, I got very much interested in this daily intermittent fasting. So I started practicing it myself in 2010. And then 2011, I was looking for jobs, postdoc jobs, and reached out to Eric Ravison, who may have actually, probably, I think he can be credited with doing the first modern day study of intermittent fasting in humans, and joined his lab. And then within a year of joining his lab, got my first research trial funded on intermittent fasting. And the rest is history, which I'm happy to walk through.
I love that you took what had organically become your passion and your interest in something that you had such a strong, first of all, hearing something that was, the 20 and 4, 20 hours fasting, 4 hours fueling, and thinking, wow, that's extreme. But instead of writing it off, your science brain said, wow, this is fascinating. I need to learn more. And what we're going to be talking about, y'all, today is, not just a 20-hour fasting window being, the end game, but we'll talk about what the different windows are and how to kind of decide what might work for you if this is something that you're going to try. But I love that. I love when what we're personally interested in is also what we're spending so much of our focus in with work. And it's so energizing, because probably what you're also enjoying in your downtime is learning more about this and seeing this and reading. And there's just, if you're looking for our listeners, if you look at peer-reviewed journals and you just do a search for intermittent fasting, or as you mentioned just a minute ago, time restricted eating, or TRE, there's so much that's coming out that has been published just in the past 5 years, certainly the past 10 years. So yeah, I love that. I love tying those together. So the terms intermittent fasting and time restricted eating, or even time restricted feeding, as it had been called before, they're sort of used interchangeably, but tell us kind of what the difference is, or which one is proper to use when.
Yeah, absolutely. So intermittent fasting is sort of a broad term that encompasses multiple approaches where you on a periodic basis alternate periods of eating and extended fasting. And for a long time, there was a lot of debate. Do you need to be fasting for at least 12 hours a day, 24 hours a day to say you're doing intermittent fasting? What's that cutoff? And I recently served as part of an international consensus committee with 35 experts from around the world. And we've recently decided on a 14-hour definition in humans. So it's a little different from some of the animal studies that people may have heard of, where they're using typically a 12-hour or longer definition. But in humans, we settled on a 14-hour definition for a couple of reasons. One, again, we don't really see a big increase in fat burning until more like 14 to 20 hours of fasting. And then second, the median American in the United States eats over a 12-hour period. So I'm reluctant to say the median person's currently doing intermittent fasting. So there are a lot of different types of intermittent fasting strategies, and I'll give some examples. So for instance, many religious traditions involve 1 day a week of water-only fasting. So that would be considered intermittent fasting. There's also something known as the 5-2 diet, super popular in England and the UK. And that's where you pick 2 days a week to eat the equivalent of only one meal per day. So you're having what we call a very low calorie diet. So typically, about 800 calories or less on those days. So you're technically still extending those fasting periods by, having 1 or 2 meals on those days. Another example would be alternate day modified fasting, where every other day you typically eat equivalent of about 1 meal. And then the type of intermittent fasting that I study is known as time-restricted eating. And that's when you eat in a shorter time period each day. So these are your kind of daily intermittent fasting approaches. So you're eating in a 10-hour window or less each day. So that means you're fasting for a minimum of 14 hours a day. And during that fasting period, most of us experts would say you can't eat anything with calories. You can still, for those who drink diet soda, you can do that, but no cream in your coffee, no sugar in your coffee, that sort of thing. And these daily intermittent fasting approaches are known as time-restricted eating in humans and then time-restricted feeding in animals.
Let's take a minute to share about Caraway Home, our partner for this week's episode. With so many collections of their kitchenware to explore, there is truly a Caraway solution for every kind of cook. Their thoughtfully designed sets and complimentary storage makes getting and staying organized easier than ever. The non-toxic, chemical-free ceramic coating means that food can be prepared with peace of mind that no strange chemicals are going to be leaking into your healthy ingredients. Every set is available in beautiful elevated colors to fit within any design aesthetic. We love our Caraway cookware. It's our go-to for everything from seared salmon to our Eat Fit creamy spinach. Visit carawayhome.com/fueled to take advantage of this limited time offer for 10% off your next purchase. This deal is exclusive for our listeners, so visit carawayhome.com/fueled or use promo code fueled at checkout. Caraway, non-toxic cookware made modern. I want to come back to the fat question in a minute, so I don't want to forget that. So to kind of recap, so intermittent fasting generally would be when you're going that long period of fasting, whatever that may be. As you said, it could be a water only once a week, or for religious reasons, whatever that might be. But kind of the technical or like now scientifically legal definition of fasting is 14-hour window to be considered that yes, you are like legitimately fasting. You mentioned the alternate day fasting or the 5-2 approach being common. That to me, I'm not a fan of. I've found just working with clients over the years, if someone says I'm going very low calorie, like you said, 2 days a week, number one, that's super extreme. And it can be really hard to like morph that and merge that with a family life or otherwise kind of normal patterns. But I find that it can really set up for binge eating on those other days. And people almost like save up. I had one client who he had things that were almost like stashed, not almost, he did. He had things stashed for his like eating days. And because to him, they were as much as he wanted, anything goes. And so it kind of, to me, it felt a little bit all or nothing. And so it seems like a lot of your research has focused on the time restricted eating, where it is the windows, that fasting window daily. To me, it feels, even though it may feel extreme to people, it still feels to me much more moderate approach and a consistent approach.
Yeah. And so that's a really great point. And I'll cite some of the research there on this topic too. So On the spectrum of intermittent fasting, you can see there's such a wide variety of different approaches. And let me give you one more example of approach, the fasting mimicking diet developed by Walter Longo, where you pick 3 to 5 days in a row of eating a very low calorie diet. So that's like basically a 3 to 5 day quasi fast, or what we call modified fast. These approaches are so different. And I really look at them and expect on a spectrum of, much more extreme to, like you say, moderate for time restricted eating. And I'll give you an example. On the far end of the extreme spectrum, that would be alternate day fasting. Every other day, you have a 24-hour water-only fast. So that was actually the first study that my postdoctoral mentor, Eric Ravison, did. And they did this study, and they found indeed people lost weight, but they got hungrier and hungrier over time. And in fact, many of the participants were known to the researchers, and they actually got really hangry. And so the researchers actually wrote, if you read their paper, that if you read between the lines, they basically conclude the diet's not sustainable, and they stopped studying it. And so over the past, 15, 16 years, only 2 other research groups in the world have even attempted to study alternate day modified fasting because it's too extreme.
Right. Did you say,
and the data is not favorable. It's just got too hard to stick with. Yeah. Say it again.
Did you say they got angry? It cut out as you were saying it.
Oh, hangry.
Hangry.
Yes. So hungry and angry.
The researchers are like, we're wiping our hands of this. Like, we are stepping away. We can't take the abuse anymore.
Yeah.
Jokingly, yeah.
Yeah. And so they didn't actually study it anymore.
Right.
They dropped it. It was too extreme.
Yeah.
And even for alternate day modified fasting, which is a less extreme version, where every other day you eat the equivalent of one meal, the largest clinical trials on that now show it's no better than conventional daily dieting. And in fact, people are able to stick with conventional daily dieting at a higher rate than they are at this alternate day modified fasting. So actually, people aren't able to stick with it. It's better to just cut your calories by the same amount every day. So yes, there are forms of intermittent fasting that I don't recommend because the data suggests that they're just too extreme. People can't stick with them in the long term, or they don't have enough benefit per se. But I think one other point to mention is, in some of these forms of intermittent fasting, one of the easiest ways to ask yourself whether it's extreme or not is, by how long do you have to not eat? How long are you just going without food? And some of these approaches where every other day you're not eating, I mean, it's almost, of course, it seems extreme. Obviously, at the time, people get really excited about these different approaches, but the data just hasn't stacked up. Most of these intermittent fasting strategies prescribe a certain amount of calories to eat either on their fasting days or modified fasting days. So you're kind of locked into that approach. And what I like about time restricted eating is a very different beast. You can choose not to lose weight and still do intermittent fasting on time restricted eating, because in time restricted eating, you're still eating every day. There's not a calorie target you have to hit. So you get to kind of decide whether you want to cut calories or not while you do time restricted eating. It's far more customizable than these other approaches that I think are a little more extreme.
So with the time restricted eating, the one that we're saying, that 14 hours is sort of that official fasting window minimum, that time restricted eating is what, when moving forward, if as our listeners, if you hear me say intermittent fasting, that's what I'm talking about. So I use the term intermittent fasting a lot to describe that, but technically that's the time restricted eating with that window every single day. And the difference, as Dr. Peterson was saying, is it's looking at specifically the window of time that we eat, not how much we eat. So it's not looking at there's a certain amount of calorie restriction or anything like that. It's simply looking at what is that window of time that we're eating. I'll tell you this too, Dr. Peterson. One of the things that, when it was first, a lot of the research, like you mentioned, was on animal studies. And so it was called TRF, or time restricted feeding. And as you mentioned with humans, we don't like to be thought of as like, I'm going to feed right now. So we started calling it time restricted eating. I refer to it not as an eating window. I refer to it with people as their fueling window. And yeah, I like it so much better. It's like, this is your fueling window. That's your fasting window. It just feels much more, it feels much more proactive for our health that we're fueling during this time versus either feeding or eating. So moving forward, we'll talk mostly about that window of time. The time restricted eating will kind of be the bulk of what we're talking about with intermittent fasting. With that, as we mentioned, it's looking specifically at the window of time that we eat, not specifically how much we eat. And that window can be fluid on when it is. And so there's some people may choose to do early in the day, which would be like early time restricted eating or early intermittent fasting. Some do later. You've researched this to see, and it seems like from what I've read in your publications that you lean more towards the early fasting window or the early, we should say fueling window being more beneficial than later in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to research over a decade ago. So I'll walk you all through some of this because it's super cool. So, about 12 years ago, there's a very active group of researchers in Israel, Daniela Jacobowitz and Oren Froy, who are very much interested in studying what's called the circadian system. So we each have an internal biological clock that produces these 24-hour rhythms in our body, and that's known as the circadian system, or some people might call it your body clock. And what's super interesting is we've actually known for the last 30 years, even before the circadian system was developed, that most people have better blood sugar control in the morning than they do in the afternoon, in the evening. And what that means is if you were to eat, I don't know, let's say a bowl of ice cream in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, your blood sugar levels actually spike significantly higher in the afternoon and the evening, despite the fact that you're eating the exact same food. So this obviously has, profound implications to our health, right? If you're eating the same foods, but eating them late in the day, your blood sugar control is automatically worse. So fast forward to about a decade ago, this research group started doing these clinical trials, testing the old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And what they found is that by front loading more of your calories earlier in the day, they found that participants lost significantly more weight. They improved their blood sugar control. They even took patients with type 2 diabetes, and they showed after only a single week of eating a large breakfast and a small dinner, their beta cells in their pancreas, these are the cells that produce insulin, the blood sugar hormone, they were able to produce more insulin after only 1 week, which is, staggering, because what we know in type 2 diabetes is as that disease progresses, those beta cells die more and more. And so your body actually struggles to produce enough insulin. And they even found among women with PCOS that it improved ovulation rates. So it improved fertility. And what's fascinating is we now know some of the same genes that are involved in the circadian clock are also involved in the menstrual cycle. So they're basically a bunch of these really intelligent timing genes throughout the body that coordinate these processes. So there's just been some really phenomenal data kind of all suggesting that we're sort of metabolically primed to eat more of our food earlier in the day. And so I've always been interested in this intersection between intermittent fasting, this idea of having these prolonged fasting periods to try to boost our health and improve fat burning, increase lifespan, but also eating early in the day to be in sync with these circadian rhythms in our metabolism. And so the very first study that my lab did was testing early intermittent fasting or early time restricted eating. And the reason I decided to center on that is I was interested in the question, what's the kind of maximum benefit you could get from combining all meal timing strategies? And so we did a study in men with prediabetes where we had, it's a crossover study. So it means that each participant tried both eating schedules. So we had them eat a normal eating schedule. So they ate over a 12-hour period, and then they fasted 12 hours a day. Or they tried early time restricted eating, which in our study, we tried a 6-hour window. And that meant they fasted for 16 hours a day. So it's basically a 6-hour difference in fasting. And what we found is after only 5 weeks, their insulin sensitivity or their ability to kind of move sugar out of their bloodstream and into their cells improved by about 25%, which is huge. We got about a 10-point drop in blood pressure, which kind of shocked me. I wasn't expecting an effect that large. And we found improvements in what's called oxidative stress, which you can kind of think of as molecular damage. And this was despite the fact that the participants didn't lose any weight. And we also made sure they ate the exact same food, regardless of which eating schedule they were on. So this demonstrated, and actually this is the first study to do so, for the first time that intermittent fasting can potentially have benefits, even independent of weight loss in humans. So meaning like intermittent fasting isn't just a fancy way of losing weight or a strategy to trick you into losing weight. There's something special, at least about certain types of intermittent fasting. It comes with these additional benefits over weight loss per se.
And for someone who their lifestyle is better suited to have in that window later in the day, talk to us about the benefits there. Someone is still going to see benefits. I'm actually speaking to myself here because I look at, I want to have dinner with my husband. I want to have it not in, I don't want to stop eating so early, and our entire schedule is shifted late. A lot of times we might not be home till after 7, et cetera. So my window loosely will be 2 to 8, 2 to 9. And then we're usually up till 11 or later, unfortunately, like a lot of times not going to bed sooner than that. There's still benefit though. And it's so, and the nice thing is that someone can, because we are looking at what that window is, and it's that window of time that we're eating, that fueling window, it's not mandated that it must be at a certain time. It can be what works for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk through that data. So this is actually one of the $1 million questions in the field, which is, what are the benefits you get from eating early in the day versus late in the day? Can you skip breakfast and get a lot of the same benefits of time-restricted eating? So the best data we have suggests that regardless of the time of day that you practice intermittent fasting, you're getting the weight loss benefits, or at least most of the weight loss benefits. So about 80% or more of studies testing 8-hour eating windows report that time-restricted eating helps people lose weight. And the effect is equivalent to cutting calories probably about by 200 to 300 calories a day, roughly. So we did a study where we actually modeled out what the caloric deficit was equivalent to, or the calorie cut was equivalent to. And we got that in across everyone, even averaged across people who didn't really stick with the diet well, the effect was about 214 calories. And then across people who actually genuinely stuck with the diet, it was about a 350 calorie a day benefit. And we and other labs have studied this, although we were the first to study it. And we find that intermittent fasting does not help you magically burn more calories. It seems what it does is curbs your appetite. So it kind of helps you naturally eat less. Now, some of that may be what we call a behavioral change. Like it helps people snack less because you have this simple rule. Do I eat? Do I not eat? So it kind of reduces kind of mindless eating. But we also find that there are what are called physiologic mechanisms. So specifically, time-restricted eating seems to affect some of your hunger hormones. So in studies that my lab has done, we found decreases in a hunger hormone called ghrelin. And then we also find in sort of the middle of the evening, we find increases in a satiety hormone known as PYY. Now, in the hour or two before bedtime, we do find that if you do early time-restricted eating, you tend to be hungrier than if you don't do it. But this seems to be this evening out of hunger throughout the day that we think helps people naturally eat less. So that's pretty exciting. When you start looking at 10-hour time-restricted eating windows, the data is less clear. It's not 100% clear that there's a weight loss benefit. And there may be one, but it just may be smaller, so it's harder for us to detect. But it looks like with any sort of window, any time of day, that's at least not in the middle of the night. That's 8 hours or less, there's a weight loss benefit. There also seems to be a benefit in reducing oxidative stress, that basically any sort of time-restricted eating window, regardless of the time of day, seems to reduce this molecular damage called oxidative stress. And this is important because oxidative stress is a major contributor to cardiovascular disease, and particularly the buildup of plaques inside of arteries and blood vessels and so forth. So we think this would slow, the progression to cardiovascular disease. However, there are some things that seem to be some benefits that seem to really be unique to eating earlier in the day. So for instance, if you look across most of the studies that report improvements in blood sugar are almost universally earlier in the day. And usually the cutoff in the literature, so they're, just for reference, they're probably about 150 papers now on time-restricted eating and over 100 clinical trials. So a huge increase in their research. So really exciting. So I just wrote a chapter now for the first textbook on intermittent fasting, which will be coming out soon. Plug from a big thanks to Springer for putting this together, but really exciting. So, and everyone's
on that. That's very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a wonderful chapter in there, chapter 4, that reviews all of these studies done on the effect of TRE on what we call cardiometabolic health. So think anything related to diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. When you look at all the papers, the magic cutoff seems to be about 6 p.m. So studies where the eating window ends by 6 p.m. tend to report some sort of improvement in some sort of blood sugar related parameter, whether it's 24-hour blood sugar levels that you would measure from a glucose monitor, whether that's something called insulin sensitivity, which is the ability of the insulin hormone to move sugar out of your bloodstream and into your cells. Some of these studies also report improvements in fasting insulin. There's a really nice study done in China in about, I think, 120 adults with type 2 diabetes. And they even reported that time-restricted eating with a 10-hour window ending by 6 p.m. reduced the need for diabetes medications. So they actually weaned some of their patients off these medications, which is super exciting. So food is medicine angle. And then the other area in which it looks like there are more benefits from doing time-restricted eating early in the day is actually blood pressure. And now there are not as many studies reporting on blood pressure benefit, but I would say about a third of studies that have measured blood pressure report a benefit. And most of those studies, again, are looking earlier in the day.
It's interesting.
And again, with very similar cutoffs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As you're talking about the different studies, it'll be, maybe 80% show a benefit in weight loss for this. And so I think going back to that question I asked earlier about why is there such a polarization, it can be because the literature is mixed, but there's still a hefty bit of it that is showing a positive benefit. It's not 100%, which most things related to humans are not just 100% across the board, so specifically clear cut. And then same with science and the way that different studies are designed and such. So I think that when you look at, I guess you tell us sort of a healthier approach in looking at science, that when you're looking at, you mentioned there's, over 150 papers on this. And so to isolate and make a decision based on one or a few, but instead to take a step back and look at papers that review a larger analysis of this, compilations of this.
Right. And I think it's got to be the last 3 to 5 meta-analyses done on time-restricted eating. They all report a weight loss benefit.
Yeah.
So now we have enough data to pull across all the studies to start thinking about eventually making policy recommendations or writing nutrition guidelines around it. So I think it's really exciting that we're finally getting this critical mass of data. So the punchline is it looks like with early in the day, you get some extra benefits for improving your blood sugar and your blood pressure. But regardless of the time of day, you get a weight loss benefit and you get an improvement in oxidative stress, which I think is very exciting. So what I usually tell people is do what you can do, right? So if, obviously, I have a study right now comparing early time-restricted eating versus time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast. And I hope that will be the definitive word on, do you get benefits from doing time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast? And I'm excited to see what we'll find out. But until we find that out, the best evidence we have is it's probably better to do it early in the day. And take 1 or 2 days off a week. I think it's very reasonable. This doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. There are 2 studies in animals now that show if you follow time-restricted feeding 5 out of 7 days a week, you still get most of the benefits, albeit to a lesser degree. But it's not an all or nothing approach. So my first recommendation would be the early time-restricted eating. But if you can't do that, which I suspect a majority of people can't or don't want to, then my next recommendation would be don't do intermittent fasting, but eat most of your calories early in the day. Do a sort of breakfast like a king approach, dinner like a pauper approach. And then my third recommendation, if you can't do that or don't want to do that or just prefer to do the intermittent fasting by skipping breakfast, just don't eat dinner too late.
Right. And there's so much that can make it feel overwhelming or just so complicated. It can be hard for someone to even get started when they feel that there's just so much out there. And so just really simplifying it, and it doesn't have to be one way. You can sort of, like you said, you're almost customizing it a little bit. And that's one of the nice things is that it can be fluid. It can be flexible for people. And, in listening to the summary of the data that you're saying, it's, as I think through it, it does make sense that in a perfect world, would I shift my window earlier in the day? Yeah. I also often wear a continuous glucose monitor. I'll test different foods that we're doing or different recipes. I actually have one on right now because we have a alcohol free for 40 challenge happening right now. And there's a lot of the non-alcoholic beers that are on the market. And I'm doing a TV segment that we're taping this week about non-alcoholic beers that actually won't spike your glucose levels, because even the non-alcoholics, a lot of them, personally, I may have it if I'm at 100 and I have the glucose monitor on and say my glucose levels are at, let's say 90 or 95. Drinking a Heineken 00 may bring it to like the 140s. And then I'll try some other ones, different brands. And that only brought it up 10 points or whatever it might be because they're much lower. So point being, I'll wear the continuous glucose monitor for different things to test out different foods or recipes that we're making and such. And so when I have it on, it's been really eye-opening to me at night that even a moderate amount of carbohydrate, the impact that it has, that my glucose levels go up and stay up. And so it's really affected the choices I've had at night by wearing the continuous glucose monitor. And those who've listened to this podcast before have heard me talk, and we've done full, long podcasts on CGMs, but it's really influenced. I've changed the choices I've made at night to limit the carbohydrate, even if it was only 10 or 15 grams of carbs of maybe a post-dinner snack. I would see that rise. Unfortunately, something like a fresh pressed vegetable juice, a green juice with some beets and all types of vegetable only, no fruits at all, things like that spike it. And so it would be, in thinking it through, as you're saying, if I drink that juice in the morning, it doesn't have nearly that rise and not nearly as long. However, it's sort of like makes my stomach a little rumbly. So I don't want to do that early in the morning. I would rather do it at night, whenever you're going to be home and kind of like that. So it kind of goes back to what are the other things that we're doing in our life and what's going to make most sense. If someone has a family and kids and you want to have that meal together as a family, then you're going to want to center that fueling window around what that's going to make the most sense with what your lifestyle is. Talk to us about, the mechanisms, that what's behind it, of why we're seeing such improvement. And if you don't mind doing just kind of a run through, in the intro, I talked about it a bit and we talked about a bit of the benefits, but kind of just doing a recap of the laundry list of benefits of intermittent fasting beyond weight loss.
Oh, great. Yeah, great question. So there's a lot. So just to recap, for weight loss, we think there's a reduction in appetite, as well as there's sort of an improvement or reduction in basically snacking. So it just becomes easier to kind of stick with the schedule. We see decreases in oxidative stress or molecular damage. We see increases in autophagy, or kind of recycling of proteins, worn out proteins within the cell.
Almost like that housekeeping inside of the cells.
Yeah, exactly. Housekeeping in the cells. So these are your like rejuvenative anti-aging effects. We also see increases or improvements in sort of anti-aging pathways. So for your listeners who are familiar with SIRT1 or mTOR, these are sort of key mediators involved in lifespan extension. We see favorable changes in both of those sort of key aging axes. We see decreases in blood pressure, and some of that may be through a mechanism called what we call fasting natriuresis. So the body actually, the longer you've been fasting, excretes extra salt that you've consumed in your diet, and that in turn lowers blood pressure. We also see reductions in insulin levels. And insulin is a major sort of growth signal in the body as well. People often think of insulin primarily as a fat storage hormone, which is true. It has roles in that, but it's also a major growth signal in the body. So if we lower insulin levels, we also lower something called insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, which is a major sort of pro-cancer signal. And so we think that it also reduces your risk of cancer. We see a phenomenon known as hormesis, where there's like a little bit of increased sort of immediate free radical generation, but net reduces or increases the body's sort of stress resistance. Let me make sure I cover everything. In primates, there's some data suggesting that intermittent fasting actually improves the function of HDL and sort of lipid transport throughout the body. There's also an increase in something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, in the brain, which improves cognition as well as can promote the growth of new neurons in the brain. There's just a whole ton of different mechanisms involved. And we think a lot of this is just triggered by this switch from a primarily carb burning to fat burning mode. Now, it doesn't mean that eating a low carb diet creates all the same benefits. That's not what I'm suggesting. And I think that's important to state. And there are studies that show, yes, there is some overlap in benefits there, but also intermittent fasting is hitting very different pathways too from low carb diet. So I don't think a low carb diet is a substitute for fasting.
That was going to be my next question is the if you can share, and I know that there's probably way more that's not known than is known about it, but what are some of the mechanisms that we do believe are driving these benefits that we're seeing?
Oh, well, I'd say that's, I mean, sort of some of the mechanisms I just mentioned. So I think, the prolonged fasting period where you're burning more fat, that sort of activates a net program of rejuvenation and recuperation in the body. We actually just did a study recently where we found that when people did early time restricted eating, they actually slept less. And at first we were alarmed. Oh no, people are sleeping less, but they actually report they were sleeping less and feeling better, and feeling less fatigued, like they had higher energy levels and they were sleeping about half an hour less. And so now actually what we think is going on is by having this extended fasting period, you give your body more time to rest and repair. And therefore
I guess what I'm getting at is all those benefits.
Yes.
What's triggering those benefits? Like, is it the consistently reduced insulin levels or the consistently lower insulin levels, or is it gut rest? Like, what is it that we think is actually triggering the cascade of benefits?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's one of the big questions in the field of circadian biology. Like what's the kind of trigger that triggers all these beneficial effects? So we do know insulin plays a key role. So lower insulin levels. So for instance, lower insulin levels will actually lower blood pressure levels. And it will also, lowering insulin levels will also have all these sort of protective effects against cancer because it'll reduce the production of certain growth factors. But there's also
anti-inflammatory effect that we're seeing with that too. I would imagine the inflammation markers. Is there anything that's looking at inflammatory markers?
There are, but most data suggests there's no real effect on inflammatory markers unless you're losing a lot of weight too. In which case it's probably due to the weight loss that you're seeing benefits. But we also see improvement in circadian rhythms, and that you can think of circadian rhythms as kind of these rhythms that organize our body and make us better at doing certain things at certain times of the day. So if we optimize these circadian rhythms, we're also sort of optimizing our metabolism, and you can think of the body as operating in a state of peak efficiency. So, but there's no one single mechanism. It seems like there are a bunch of different mechanisms, and we're still trying to understand a lot of them because the effects on ghrelin, they're probably partially mediated through the circadian system, but we're still trying to figure out what are those intermediate molecules that make that connection. And for a while, people thought some of these meal timing effects, that ghrelin was quote unquote the kind of synchronizer of all these circadian rhythms in the body, and it turns out not to be the case. So in some cases, we don't even know all the steps or mechanisms involved.
How much does our choice of food during that fueling window, how much does that choice of what we do choose to eat in that time affect the benefits that someone is reaping? Because one of the things that I'll guide is if someone is choosing to do intermittent fasting, then during the fueling window, we still want to have the nutritious whole foods, all the things that someone would consider as part of that wholesome, healthful diet. We still want to have those as your primary choices. It's not a kind of that all or nothing we talked about earlier. It's not a license to have any and everything because it's my fueling window. Is there anything that's looked at the types of foods and the quality of food choices consumed and how that influences benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go back to something you said a little while ago. So you noticed that sometimes even when you're eating your green juices at night, you got more of a blood sugar spike. So there's been some cool studies looking at how the time of day that you eat affects the glycemic load or of the food you eat. So basically how much it spikes your blood sugar. What's really fascinating is if you eat junk food in the morning, it doesn't spike your blood sugar as much
So
as if you
Oreos for
eat it late
breakfast.
in the day. Yeah. Yeah. So if you're going to have your Oreos or your ice cream, eat it for breakfast is sadly the punchline. But what's fascinating, I mean, I'm going to try to illustrate it with my hands here. If you eat healthy food in the morning or junk food in the morning, maybe this is your gap, right? In terms of how much higher the junk food will spike your blood sugar levels. But if you eat those same foods in the evening,
right.
The junk food just goes through the roof in terms of how much it spikes your blood sugar levels. So really, as much as possible, that kind of tells us a couple things. One, really try to avoid eating, your quickly digesting carbohydrate foods late in the day. Better to have them earlier in the day. Avoid junk food late in the day. And also probably, make dinner a smaller meal. So what we know about some of the mechanisms that are involved there, once it becomes dark outside, your body tends to start producing melatonin. And so you can even think of, even at 7, 8, 9 p.m., your body's starting to produce melatonin, and melatonin raises your blood sugar levels directly. And so the sort of the more hours you can leave between when you finish eating dinner and going to sleep, the better. So most people don't know this, but it's helpful to know for an average size meal, it takes roughly 4 to 6 hours to digest it. So if you actually want to go to bed on an empty stomach, which is one of these very wise old adages, that means for a lot of people, say you go to bed at 10 p.m., that means you need to stop eating between 4 and 6 p.m. Obviously, that's not practical for a lot of people, but it goes to show you a lot of us, probably the vast majority of people, go to bed while they're still digesting food. So your blood sugar levels will stay elevated for longer.
And so speaking to that quality of those food choices that we're reaching for, if you're taking this initiative and you're being proactive and you're looking to incorporate something like intermittent fasting into your lifestyle, we encourage you to also make that extra effort to the choices that you are making, keep those healthy, keep those wholesome. It's not a license to have whatever, non-healthy foods simply because it's the fueling window. So the assumption that we would say, but we can't assume it, is keep those foods as healthy as wholesome, your plant-based fats, your lean proteins, all, as much your plants as possible there. I wanted to ask your thought, a couple of things. One on the duration. I had made this note before you and I started talking, but the ideal duration of like fasting versus fueling window. And, 14-10 sounds like it's sort of the minimum that you would say, a 14-hour fasting window, 10-hour fueling window. Or someone could do a 16-8 or 18-6. Is there anything that you see as kind of the sweet spot that you would say, if someone's looking to get started with this, that you would recommend?
Yeah, great question. So I used to recommend that people would start with an eating window of 8 to 10 hours. And I think I'd still say that's a great place to start as a first target. But now with a lot of the evidence coming out where it shows for a 12-hour eating window, you're not really getting any benefit. And for 10 hours, the data is not great. I would tend to recommend an 8-hour window as a minimum if you really want to see benefits. And then I've experimented with a variety of windows. So this is, my N of 1 experiment just on myself. I didn't like a 5-hour window for myself personally because I was eating all my food in such a short period of time. And I was doing it to maintain my weight, obviously, not to lose weight. And with a 5-hour window, I just had these huge swings in blood sugar that just did not feel great. So my personal experience was best with the 6 to 8-hour window, but honestly, I'd say play around with what works for you because it's a combination of what you're willing to do as well as what, and what fits your family as well as what you can do. But I think for most people, something in the 6 to 10-hour range is a good target. You just be aware if you have a 10-hour window, you're probably getting significantly fewer benefits.
And so when Dr. Peterson is saying 6 to 10 hours, just to kind of, recap it, that's the 6 to 10 hour fueling window, which would translate to a 14 to 18 hour fasting window. And so, and if you think about it, 14 hours seems really long. It's really not, and so if let's say someone stops eating at 7 p.m. and they don't eat the next morning till 7 a.m., you're already doing a 12-hour fast right there. So if you stopped eating at 7 p.m. and your first time you eat in the morning is 9 a.m., that still doesn't seem wild. It's very feasible for many people. And then, of course, it can get more and more extreme, but I agree with you. I think a 6-hour fueling window starts to feel short, even for me. You mentioned 5. There's 20 and 4, which to me seems really short. And also, it would seem very hard to work into society, like your normal, the culture of the people in our lives. We talked about the timing of when the window is. So for another thing, going back to one of the things, and I actually have an article that's going to be going out in one of our local magazines, St. Charles Avenue, in just a few weeks. And so I'll be linking to this podcast episode in that article, which is exciting too. Because, the article's short, it's a page. And so this is such a great opportunity to go deeper into it. But one of the things that I share in there is I do a modified version. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this because I know that it's not technically the benefits that we talked about, but because I'm not looking at, I'm not looking at weight loss as being one of the things that I want to strive for with it. I find a lot of benefit as far as energy levels. I mentioned kind of like the GI things. I have GI benefits, gastrointestinal benefits that all, I have IBS, irritable bowel for our listeners. And so what I find is the later in the day also helps with that, so all of those things for me kind of work to push that fueling window later in the day. So again, like I said, maybe 2 till 8 or so, but I also am super active. And so for me, going without any calories until 2 p.m. doesn't feel good. And so kind of going again back to our listeners, listening to your body, doing what works for you, not feeling like you must follow certain regimented rules. What I started doing is gradually incorporating fats during that window. So still limiting carbohydrates. So carbohydrate and protein. Carbohydrate especially, of course, raises our insulin levels, but even protein foods raise our insulin to some degree. So incorporating fats, foods that are primarily fats in there. So real cream and coffee. I know that you mentioned if you're having something like that doesn't count, like air quote, count as fasting, that or things like avocado or olive oil, like plant-based fats, so that I still get some calories through that morning. And 2 p.m. is not the first time I'm getting calories. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's not a lot of research on that, so it's hard to say. My kind of default stance is it's still quite different from fasting based on the small number of studies we have that show low-carb diets and intermittent fasting activate some similar pathways, but some different pathways. I think Pam Peake and Frank Greenway, who are at Pennington Biomedical Research Center, did an interesting study on that. They were looking at using a low carbohydrate sort of snack bar to extend the fasting period. And I think they did get some benefits for weight loss, if I recall. So there are a number of people starting to answer or study that question, but I don't think we know for certain, but at least in the strict sense, wouldn't count it as equivalent to intermittent fasting.
Right. And it's still getting the calories in there. You're not having that full gut rest, the full complete gut rest. But yeah, for me, having really dialing back in that window, but not going zero, I find, I think for my own benefit and probably the benefit of other people around me, I think that, feeling that I am still fueling my body well, but putting the bulk of my calories later in the day and then choosing when I do have something, it's just going to be those small amounts of fats in there. So I mentioned in the article, if y'all are looking at that, if you read that I do the modified version, and that's sort of what I do. As Dr. Peterson says, maybe I'm not even doing modified version of intermittent fasting.
Well, we can just leave it as TBD. So
right. Thank you.
But again, right. So in any research study we do, we report averages, right? So I'll tell you, so one of the first studies I did on early time restricted eating had these massive improvements in blood sugar control. When you looked at the data in individuals, everyone but one participant got better. And one participant very clearly got worse. So it was one of those things where you start scratching your head because it wasn't like he got slightly worse. He got significantly worse, where you're like, okay, this isn't measurement noise or like a bad testing day. And it turns out this person had been an overnight shift worker for 20 years of his life. And so his circadian rhythms were likely different. And so we messed up his meal timing relative to his internal schedule. Now, I can't tell you that today what would have been the right schedule for him, but there's still room for individual variability, right? So I would never want someone to go against like, oh, I'm feeling sick or doing XYZ. That said, when we've done studies, we find that it usually is a little difficult in the beginning. And people usually say it takes at least a couple of weeks to adapt.
Just
And
like anything,
so,
it's going to be uncomfortable with that change.
yeah. And what's really fascinating is there's been research on Ramadan intermittent fasting, and that's where you do dry fasting during the day. So for your listeners, dry fasting is where you not only abstain from calories, but also water. And in these Ramadan fasting studies, they find at the beginning of the month, people have normal hunger patterns, but by the end of the month, the time of day that your hunger hormone peaks completely shifts to being at nighttime. So your sort of physiology starts adapting to whatever you're eating. So the reason why I think it's so hard in the beginning for people to kind of get over this hurdle is that the body is literally adapting to these new meal timing schedules. And in the process of adapting, it's temporarily harder than whatever you're doing currently until your body like readapts to that new eating schedule.
So give it time.
Completely fascinating.
We don't want to go into it for 1, 2, 3 days or even a week and say, I'm giving up too much here.
It takes a while to, the term that we would use in circadian biology research or chronobiology research would be entrainment. So it takes a while for your sort of organs to adapt to the new effective time zone that you're eating in.
Time zone, yeah. The what are the any risk that we would say or we want to share with people? And then is there anyone who should not fast?
Yeah, great question. So there are a couple known risks. So one, we find in some of our studies that participants do get more thirsty. And part of that could be this phenomenon I mentioned earlier, fasting natriuresis, where the body excretes more sodium. It also excretes more water. So people may need to drink more water in the beginning. And that's actually a little bit similar to ketogenic diets where people tend to need to drink more water. And as a result, sometimes people report headaches as well. And then who should not do it? So we don't recommend it while people are pregnant or breastfeeding. There's also data suggesting that adolescents and kids should not follow these approaches because they're growing and developing. And at least the animal model research shows if you start intermittent fasting in juvenile rodents, it actually stunts their growth and leads to some adverse outcomes in regards to their health. And there's even some data in Ramadan fasting that shows that women who engage in Ramadan fasting during certain trimesters, that behavior is associated with lower IQ in their children. So out of abundance of caution, I do not recommend that. And then I would say if you are currently have diabetes and are either on insulin or oral medications, to just work with your doctor because there are increased reports of low blood sugar. Now, obviously, some of that could be good if you're coming off your medications, but we wouldn't want anyone's blood sugar to tank too low and for them to have what's called a hypoglycemic event. That could actually be a serious risk to their health. So just work with your physician if you're on any medications.
And to that note too, we'll see often, someone starts to lose weight, they start to see these improvements. If they're not adjusting diabetes medications, but also blood pressure medications, they can experience lows in that too. And so sometimes it may be hard to distinguish which it is. So making sure that you're staying on top of, you're taking certain medications, staying in touch with your healthcare team of, do I need to adjust these as my weight is coming down? And then I think we also, you mentioned it briefly earlier too, when we look at who would we not recommend intermittent fasting for, I would typically say someone with an existing eating disorder or even prior history of eating disorder, that's, it's probably not what I would recommend, especially if someone is still, maybe not in a healthy place in that relationship with food. It can be triggering for them. And so,
I think binge eating too is a good point. We just don't have data. So if you do have such a history, proceed with caution or just don't proceed for now until you can reestablish those healthy patterns.
Agreed. And so if someone says, okay, well, how do I start? I think, our takeaway here would be start with at least a 14-hour fasting window. If you can extend it to 16 hours, even better. But even if you're starting out right with that 14-hour fasting window, which might mean that would mean your 10-hour fueling window. Ideally, listening to Dr. Peterson and hearing what the research is showing us the most benefit sounds like it's going to be that earlier in the day fueling window. So if you have the opportunity to put your 8 or 10 hour or even 6 hour fueling window, the earlier you can shift that into your day, the better. But again, it's going to be whenever that works for you and whenever it's going to work with your lifestyle that you can really be consistent with it. When we look at, and I'm kind of recapping what you said, I'm looking at my notes too. When we look at that timing, regardless, even if you are shifting more towards the nighttime, making sure you leave that window, a strong window of time between your last meal or snack of the day and when you're going to sleep. Ideally, as much as 4 hours, you said, or even 6 hours. I'll usually say at least 3 for good digestion and such.
That's a great target.
And so that's sort of the quick rundown of how do you get started. You can either shift that fueling window a little bit if you knew that, say you're usually ending your fueling window at, let's just say 6 p.m., but you have dinner tomorrow night with some friends and y'all aren't going to meet until 7. Then you may choose to either that day, you're simply not doing it, or you can push that window back a little bit. So again, you can kind of be malleable with it. And again, realizing that I think one of the beautiful things about it is that it can be so flexible and it's not a one size fits. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a couple of last things. Talk to us about the research that you have coming up. And you guys are currently in a call for participants.
Yeah, great question. So this is super exciting. So I'll start with, we have a study testing whether intermittent fasting can slow the aging process. So this is super exciting. So this is a study that's going on both in Louisiana and Alabama. So one site is at Pennington Biomedical Research Center, and the other is where I am at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And we're comparing losing weight via calorie restrictions, so reducing your calories by about 20%, 25%, versus doing intermittent fasting by eating in an 8-hour window that's on the earlier side. So dinner by 6 p.m. And we're trying to see if the approaches can either slow your rate of aging or make you biologically younger. So there's this concept called biological age, which is a measure of not how many birthdays you have or how old you are by the calendar, but how young or old your body really is. And there's some really, really cool methods now for how you can estimate someone's biological age. You can kind of look at their DNA and you can get a sense of how young or old they are. So we're trying to literally see whether intermittent fasting could be a lifelong process that could potentially, slow the aging process and maybe even, reduce the development of chronic diseases and so forth. And this is based on that really exciting data that I mentioned in rodent studies where intermittent fasting does extend lifespan. So for this study, we're looking for adults who are either normal weight or slightly overweight, who are between the ages of 25 and 49, and who would be willing to sign up for the study. If you complete the entire study, you'll get a stipend of $2,500. And it's a 24-week program, so roughly half a year. We provide counseling and support. And it's a really great opportunity just to either, if you always wanted a health coach to help you lose weight or try intermittent fasting, like this is the great study for you. And you're helping, science for us to figure out, is this something we can recommend and that will save lives or improve lives?
Will they have access to what their markers are, the DNA analysis is looking at that? Will they see that data on themselves?
If they want to see it, they absolutely can. We're going to measure everything from, if you've heard of telomere length, so how long those caps are at the end of your telomeres, the number of stem cells you have in your body, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your muscle mass, your body fat, how many calories you burn. I mean, you name it. We're mentioning so many awesome things in this study.
And where does someone go?
Data. Yeah, go ahead.
Where does someone go to sign up?
Yeah, so we have a website. If you go to the Pennington Biomedical Research Center website, so www.pbrc.edu, there'll be a list on the website for clinical trials. And if you click on that link and look under the aging trials, there'll be a link there. And I can also send you after the podcast a link to put in the show notes. So that would be the easiest way to apply.
Yes, that's perfect. And then what is the deadline for someone to apply?
Probably in the next a few months, we'll stop enrolling patients. So the sooner the better.
I have several people that I'm going to, hey, if you're interested, I think they would be great candidates for it. And then the textbook, when is the textbook going to be published that you've contributed the chapter to?
Oh, great question. I assume sometime this summer.
Okay. And will that be available to the lay public, or will it be, where will it be used or available?
I think it'll be available to the lay public, but you'll obviously probably have to pay to buy the book. Yeah.
And will that be used in university settings and are there courses on intermittent fasting that are being taught? Like, what is this textbook going to accompany? I love this.
Oh, so probably not integrated into a course per se, but like, we often have like textbooks for people who practice diabetes. The goal is that any sort of healthcare provider would pick up the textbook and say, I want to incorporate this in my clinical practice. So it could be nurses, could be doctors, and so forth. One, I think, obvious area is endocrinologists, because they deal with both obesity and with type 2 diabetes. And that's where we have some of the strongest data. I
love that, because it's compiling the research, it's giving that tool, it's providing so much data to the practitioners who, like you said, if they haven't been looking at all the data, now you're 150 plus papers in, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. Where do we start? So having access to something like this can be incredibly useful. Any last things that you would say for our listeners before we sign off?
No, I think we covered so much, and there's also a lot we couldn't cover. So hopefully this gives people a good flavor. And I think we really are starting to see the weight of evidence suggesting intermittent fasting has some benefits. It's not a panacea, doesn't improve all aspects of your health, but it seems like there are enough positive benefits across multiple areas of health that I suspect some time in the next probably 3 to 8 years, we'll probably start seeing some of the major societies releasing nutrition guidelines on intermittent fasting.
Going back to the polarization of it, I think once that happens, there's likely more of an accepted integration of this into the scientific community, into the healthcare providers. It seems like something that's far less fringe than maybe, people are perceiving it as now. And like I said earlier, admittedly, a decade ago, 2010 to 14, there was starting to be more and more buzz about it. And I was doubtful. I thought this is, really like, I almost was dismissive was the word I used earlier. And it was, I thought, don't even waste your time with that. If you're cutting your calories, you're going to see the benefit. And over the years, seeing more and more research come out. And I think it is a hard thing to tease out. What is the difference of intermittent fasting specifically that is above and beyond simple caloric restriction? Those two things are sometimes hard to see the difference. And that's where sometimes the data is mixed. But as you said, there's ample data out there that is supporting it, and so many other physiological benefits, mental health benefits, cognitive benefits far beyond weight loss. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. I will put links to best way for people to see more information about the research you're doing. Are you on social media? I am not. I didn't think you were. I had pilfered around looking for you. 100% of my time on research, doing the evidence to try to shape clinical guidelines. Maybe someday I will once I get everything under control. But no, I think that's my babies, the studies. I'll link to your LinkedIn, because I think also your LinkedIn is just your LinkedIn is wildly impressive. So I am grateful for your time on this podcast. I'm grateful for you putting the knowledge and the time that you're putting into researching this topic for all of us, to help us understand more about something that many of us find fascinating, a lot of people find a benefit to, and helping us to really kind of weed through how can people prioritize where they're going to focus their time, their energy, and to really get the most outcome. So thank you for all that you're doing for us in that. Sure. Thank you so much. All right. Thanks again so much for your time. All right. Thank you so much for having me. A tremendous thank you to Dr. Peterson for carving out the time to join us today. I felt like that's only the tip of the iceberg. There was so much more that I feel like we could have talked with her about. I hope to have her back on with other conversations about intermittent fasting as she has more and more data, more and more research that they're wrapping up, and continue to share and learn from her as she's learning from the research that they're doing. I'll include the links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode, especially those of you who might be interested in the research that they are currently doing the call for participants. So she mentioned that there will be a site in Alabama and there'll also be a site in Louisiana with the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. So if you have been interested in trying intermittent fasting, if you would like the coaching and support, like she talked about with that, 24 weeks, so about half a year, as she said, and then, seeing and learning all types of other data about ourselves. I think it's going to be a really cool trial, not only for what we'll learn, what the researchers will learn, and what we'll see as the end result of it, but I think it'd be a really cool experience for participants going through it as well. So I'll include the link in the show notes of this episode. If you are interested, you can click and see that, see if you might be a fit to be a part of that study. With intermittent fasting, if there's so many different layers to it, there's so many different ways that someone can dip their toe into this space, see what works for you as far as what your fasting window might be, your fueling window, what time of day you're doing it. What does this look like for you? Again, the beauty of it being that it's not a one size fits all. It's not just cut and dry one specific set way. It can be malleable. You can shape it to work with you, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing commitment. And I think that, understanding the 14-hour fasting window would be ideal to try to achieve that, which would mean a 10-hour fueling window. And so I think, as we said earlier, if you stop eating at 7 p.m. and you're eating breakfast at 9 a.m., that doesn't feel like a crazy long stretch for many of us. There's the caveats we talked about, the people who we would give caution, talk with your healthcare provider before you're starting any new program. If you're taking certain medications for blood sugar, for diabetes, or blood pressure, someone with a existing eating disorder or history of eating disorder, there's, strong flags we would look at there, warning signs that we would say either you caution or specifically don't do it. And if you have a question about whether or not it's a fit for you, 100% talk with your healthcare provider first. Regardless, I want to hear what you think about it. We said at the very top of this, it is a very polarizing subject. To me personally, my opinion on it is there's a lot of benefit that can be had from intermittent fasting, even if it's not something that is personally something we think that is a fit for us or we want to recommend to our clients or our patients specifically. Understanding that there can be a benefit from it. And so my hope is to kind of broaden our understanding of it and hopefully minimize some of the backlash or the negativity on it. And instead of jumping to that, looking at, okay, let's look at both sides. And as Dr. Peterson said, a lot of the research is mixed. There's a lot of research that is showing benefit. There's other research that is showing maybe not much more benefit, if any, than simple caloric restriction. So science is still unfolding on this. But for those who have tried it and experienced it and have experienced that positive benefit, I hope that this can help you understand some of the mechanisms of how that's happened and, why you're feeling these benefits. And for those of you who've kind of been curious about it, is this something that you want to do? Is this something that you think could be beneficial? How do you even get started? I hope that this has given you some of those answers as well. So always reach out to me if you're incorporating this. If you have more questions, always reach out. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com. You can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.